It is a privilege for us to spend some time here at your conference, and as was mentioned, I have had the opportunity to be here on numerous occasions before. We find that when we work with SDAO members as clients, sometimes that's in the area of what I would call standard HR things, employee handbooks, forms, performance management, or compensation. Sometimes the situations are a little bit more sticky or difficult, and there's some conflict or relationship issues. And sometimes there are issues or lack of clarity that surface between the general manager or the executive director and the board. And those obviously have the opportunity to be the biggest concerns because they impact virtually the entire set of operations that may be going on for the district. So as a result, out of that came the idea of having a session talking about the board as supervisor. What is that role? For some of you who are board members or commission members, you have come to that role with a significant amount of supervisory and managerial experience. Others individuals come to the commission or the board role without a lot of that, and yet find themselves in a position where, as part of a group, they're having to supervise one individual, and that can be a bit more cumbersome or difficult. And so as a result, hopefully today's session will give us some talking points to be able to talk about that. I want to start by saying these are some things you already know. And the first of those is that being a board or commission member is hard work. I love the little graphic. It's tough, it's hard work. No doubt about it, it's incredibly hard. Everyone knows it's hard work. And yet you all signed up for that. It's so interesting to think about those comparisons. And part of it is because there's a whole different group of constituencies that feed into that board or commission process. There's the folks who voted for you, there is the staff, there is the public that now expects something of you even if they're not the ones who initially voted for you. And there's a lot of regulatory compliance. So regulators and compliance folks are very concerned about whether or not you can fulfill all those responsibilities. And different groups of people have entirely different expectations of you as a group and perhaps you as individuals. And that's one of the things that makes it hard. There are so many things to know about. Sometimes what we find is that folks come to the board with a particular set of concerns. That's why they ran for the board position in the first place, is because they were concerned about rates, or they were concerned about expansion of services, or they were concerned about the fact that some services were being curtailed, and they felt that that was inappropriate. Sometimes it's simply out of a desire and an intent to serve the community. And this is an opportunity to be able to do that. And yet you come to the role and discover there's so many things to know about. And there is such a level of detail that's expected. And that can make it difficult. And so if we're busy focusing on trying to learn all those things, the supervisory piece of it may be something that we don't spend as much time on, or we don't focus on. It isn't as obvious to us that that's an area where there may be some need for additional attention. And you then have the responsibility of being able to create policy, make decisions, and see that they are carried out. And sometimes it isn't as simple as saying, we've made a decision, go forth and do good work. It just doesn't seem to work like that. There's more detail, there's more operational implications, etc. So I'm not telling you anything you don't know from the standpoint of this is a very complicated job. But one of the things that is hardest about this is supervising the the executive director or the general manager, and trying to figure out what's the Goldilocks status. What is not too much? What is not too little? What is just right? And it's complicated by the fact that the executive director may already have been in place when you got elected and came to the board. And so therefore we kind of accept the person in that role, and we're uncomfortable being able to raise our hand and say, can you tell me a little bit more about what you do with that? And I'm wondering whether or not, and if you don't have other new board members who came on at the same time, and if they all look comfortable, it invites us to be a little more quiet. Or it makes us feel more conspicuous if in fact we raise an issue. And so that can be a concern and make us odd person. I usually would say odd man, but odd person out with the rest of the commission or the board, and that can feel uncomfortable as well. So we have to figure out what's just right. And this is a conversation, at least in my experience with boards, where I find that boards and commissions very seldom have an intentional conversation. What does it mean to be the supervisor of this general manager or this executive director? What is our role? How are we doing it now? What should be perhaps considered to be done differently? There is very seldom conversation about that. Now, there may be conversation that says, gee, I just didn't think we got enough detail on that. I'm hoping we get more detail later on. And another commission member will say, well, I thought it was probably okay. I got as much information as I really wanted. And both of them walk away a little vaguely discontented, but don't see that as an opportunity to necessarily then have a conversation about how much information and what kind of data and how often do we want it. There isn't that conversation that then takes place as the whole group. And that's one of the things that can make a significant difference. So as we look at all of this, then what we're saying is, how do we do that? Well, in preparation for this, and I have to say I was a bit disappointed, I went looking, you know how you Google topics? I went looking for the definitive information that I could use as reference for all of this. I was sure there would be dozens of articles. There would be white papers written about this. There would be board materials that had been sent out on the internet and part of this is the way we do business here. And you know, there just wasn't hardly any information. I went looking at the Council on Foundations and for not-for-profit organizations. I went looking in the public sector support sites that are specifically designed to provide information. And I got all kinds of information about your regulatory responsibilities. I got all kinds of information about your responsibilities to the public constituent. I got all kinds of information about what was a public meeting, what was a public record. I mean, there is a wealth of material. But board as supervisor? Not so much. In fact, hardly any. And I'll share with you the one thing I did find that I thought was particularly relevant just in a little while. But mostly, what I found was a vague sentence here or a vague role. And one of the responsibilities, many articles said, is to oversee the executive director and conduct the annual performance review. End of sentence, end of commentary, end of the subject entirely. But then there'd be paragraphs and paragraphs about a wide variety of other things. So I want to be candid with you. A lot of this is ginned up from my own experience in talking with other folks who do a great deal of public sector work with commissioners and with boards, and to be able to try and build the beginnings of information regarding this subject. so that there is something that you can react to. You may agree with some of the things I say, you may disagree. And what I really hope is that it sponsors a conversation in your commission or at meeting or in a board meeting where you then have a discussion about what is our role as supervisor, what does that mean, how do we want to affect it, and to the point that you feel it's appropriate that you document that so that new people coming into that role have some sense of what you think your rights and responsibilities are relative to supervision of the ED or the general manager. If you walk out of here and do things a lot differently than I suggest, but you're intentional about it and that's what you feel fits your situation, then I feel like I've been the spark that got that started. And that's really my hope relative to all of this. So let's talk a little bit about some things that may provide some grounds for discussion. I'm going to share with you 3 stories. They are not of any one organization. They are compilations. They have some real positive points. There are some areas that might represent a concern in each of these, and I am hopeful that together we can find the commonalities and learn from those 3 stories. And you have those obviously in your materials, and I would encourage you to share your materials with any board or commission member that isn't here to be able to generate some conversation when you return home. Here's story number 1. Small organization hired a subject matter expert, not somebody who had any supervisory or management experience previously, but somebody who was enormously well-grounded in the area that the district was responsible for. If you think water or irrigation or electric or any number of healthcare, whatever it might be, why, if you think about somebody who knows that area extremely well, but really hasn't supervised folks before. The board was very clear with their new hire about the board's role relative to policy and regulatory purposes. So they were very explicit about, we make policy, your job is to execute and operationalize that. Your job is to tell us if, in fact, you think there's an issue with policy and it's conflicting with new information that you receive, or if you think that we have misstated it in some fashion or come to the wrong conclusion, we want you to speak up about that. They were not clear. They were not clear about their responsibility to fashion a plan for the development of the executive director, even though they knew the director they hired had almost no management or supervisory experience. So that was not addressed in any fashion at all. Staff problems ensued. The executive director was in a position of being uncertain what problems in the staff to address or not address, how firmly to address that, what past practice had been. The executive director struggled with the staff, began to retreat to the ED office, work on policy, regulatory, board agendas, all of those things, and try not to have to mingle too much with the staff because it was clear that they were just not necessarily performing well and didn't necessarily like the ED. The board became unhappy with the ED because the staff continued to approach the board with problems relative to the ED. Difficulties, omissions, not doing this, heavy-handed, not allowing me to do my own job, or I have no guidance and no help with that. That's story number 1. So I would ask that you take just a moment and make a note or 2 in the margin. What do you think some of the issues were? I'm not going to give you long because I'm going to give you more time about that in a moment. But I want to be able to capture your initial thoughts about that. So let's look at story 2. Story 2 is a medium-sized organization who hired a new general manager. They provided very clear communication about what was to occur, what was to be accomplished. And they had a very ambitious plan. The departure of the previous executive director had not been anticipated. That individual left the state in the middle of just starting to execute and operationalize a brand new strategic plan. So a new executive director was hired. The organization was concerned about the fact that it had fallen behind what it needed to do because of the search process. So they were anxious to have a lot of activity and accomplishment as quickly as possible. They did not discuss how it was to be done, but they laid out a pretty aggressive agenda about what needed to occur. The GM had, because he felt like there was lots to be accomplished and people had perhaps been a little too laid back, a little too casual in really accomplishing things. And the board had this aggressive agenda, and therefore it needed to that, the organization needed to be ramped up to get going and accomplish these things. And he began to direct people's activities. He began to be very specific about what needed to happen, when it needed to happen, and who needed to do it, etc. The professional staff particularly, of which there were several, felt as though they were being micromanaged, felt as though they were being undervalued, felt as though they were being told they didn't know how to do their job, because every time they turned around, here was him saying, this is what needs to be done, and no, set that one aside and work on this one, etc. So there was no expectation from the board that harmony or that consensus or that culture really mattered. And if it was the case that they really were okay with him ramping up and creating a sense of discord or some unhappiness in the process of moving forward, they never told him that, and they certainly didn't tell the employees through him that, you know, major change was afoot. The organization had not experienced that kind of style previously. So one employee finally, quote, bravely was the word that was used, bravely went to a board member and said, here's what's going on. We're all struggling. This is the issue. And the board member said, well, why don't we meet just the two of us, no one needs to know, and I'll coach you on how you can help him learn more about the organization, etc., and be more friendly, be more warm, be more engaging with employees. That's something I do with my staff, and so I can help you with this situation. Positive or not so positive? So let me give you a minute or two to write in the margin any concerns you have relative to that, or your thoughts about why that was the right approach, or perhaps a different approach would have been appropriate. All right, story number 3. Executive director's been in the position for several years. Board members have changed during that period of time. So the board members, the vast majority of them, are much newer than the executive director. The board relied on the executive director as the source of information. this is the way we've done things, here's why we've done them this way. This was the history as well as a valued resource for the board. The board began to notice, however, that the ED was less and less forthcoming about operations, issues, money, the financial status, that the reporting out to the board was becoming less and less detailed. The information was arriving in a less timely fashion, so therefore it didn't give board members an opportunity to be able to review all of it. If there were questions, the ED became very irritated and annoyed, very obviously distressed. In some cases, the ED got very silent and didn't respond. In other cases, the response was one out of anger and agitation, saying, do you not think I know how to do this? You know how long I've been doing this? Do you understand that you don't need to interfere with this? I'm the one who's charged with taking care of these issues. These are operational issues. This is not something the board needs to be troubled with. And the board, knowing it wasn't the expert, knowing they didn't have the history, having relied on the individual for extended resources and information and caretaking of the organization, became intimidated. They didn't want to speak up. They didn't want to address things. They had conference calls, 2 or 3 of them in advance, and I don't mean breaking the meeting rule, but they would check with one another about, did you have a question about this? Do you want to ask it? I don't want to ask it. Before the meeting, to be able to make sure that they didn't end up on the wrong side of somebody who seemed to have a real reactionary posture. They knew less than the ED did, and so as a result, they avoided the subjects. It became apparent that the executive director didn't want to talk about. One board member broke with the rest of the board and began to say, no, I won't approve this, or I won't vote for acceptance of. But since they were in obviously the minority, that voice simply got run over. And there was a conflict avoidant kind of posture that was being exhibited at board meetings and in conversations relative to the lack of information that the board had. So again, I'll give you a couple of minutes to make a margin note about what is the issue here, or what are your thoughts about the board as supervisor in this role? So let's talk a little in detail about what went wrong, and then we can have a conversation about what might have been other courses of action for some of these. So you've got in your material, hopefully there's enough room to write there, a place to be able to identify what went wrong with situation number 1. And if you'll recall, situation number 1 is where we hired a subject matter expert, but without a lot of managerial or supervisory skills, didn't really build a plan to be able to help that new individual fulfill that portion of their role, which created issues for the staff, etc. So who has a thought about what went wrong there? Yes?
The ED wasn't totally vetted when he was hired.
So the question or the comment is the ED wasn't fully vetted at time of hire. Okay? And there was a note or a hand behind you?
People skills needed to be developed some way or another.
People skills needed development, okay? And the lady sitting next to you had her hand up as well. Yes?
Was there a proper job description in it?
Okay. Was there a proper job description? Did we really understand the role that supervisory piece played in the ED? Yes, sir.
I think in the context of your story, you tell what went wrong. I felt they did vet the candidate, but they knew what the weaknesses were, but failed to execute a plan to develop those into strengths.
Okay, so the idea is that the people hiring knew that this individual didn't have those skills, but they didn't see them as important enough or didn't put a plan in place to help develop those. What else? Yes?
Probably a lack of policies and procedures that would have allowed for the board and the new hire to really understand what the job was going to be about.
Yeah, the absence of material could be something that then would have helped the new individual understand what that was expected of them relative to that. But I think the job description is a really valuable tool. It's just that sometimes we say, and here's the job description. And that's probably not sufficient. We need to, and that's assuming that we have one, because sometimes we don't. But then saying, what's behind each one of these bullets or these essential functions? What does this really mean to us, the commissioners? Because how difficult is it for you to serve your constituents and your district and keep all of the 30,000 foot level things going if in fact your ED or general manager is not able to effectively supervise and create some coalescence in the staff? Yes, sir.
I think it clearly goes back to the board. I think clearly the board was not doing their job properly or didn't understand what their job was.
Right.
And it just ran downhill from there.
And you know, without ever meaning to sound hypercritical, it frequently starts at the top. And if we don't understand our role, and if we can't effectively communicate someone else's role and know how we're going to know whether or not that's being done, and be clear about those things, whether it's at time of hire or assignment or conversation about what does this mean to us, it makes it really difficult. And so there is certainly some risk in hiring somebody for a manager role who hasn't managed. But hiring somebody for a manager role who hasn't managed, and we don't fill in around that or provide some support or clarity about expectations, we just assume that they will do it, is probably gets us into difficulty. And just in case there's anybody who thinks that management is simply signing off on time cards and approving vacation, let me suggest to you, it's a whole lot bigger than that. And many of you have probably encountered that. Yes, sir.
You can also hire someone with technical skills, but you also, as a board member, your responsibility is the people that your supervisor supervise. And if
Yes.
you're willing to do that, then make sure organizations are much more effective.
And we do struggle. His comment is about hiring somebody with technical skills. We do struggle with the challenge of trying to balance those technical skills, that knowledge, all of the things that we want that person to be able to speak to the outside world effectively about and appropriately, and the internal operations of management and development of people and evaluation and all of those things. There was another hand, yes.
I think going back to the board, and when you're getting a person that has all of the technical qualifications, but not necessarily the experience in the management, if you look at the person, is he a people person? Does he know how to communicate? Ask those questions. That's very integral in the part of what the board does for that. Because that will say, okay, does this person have some of the things that's going to be needed
Yes.
to learn how to do that? And then, if he has that, then make sure that you build the proper guidelines for him to get those skills.
Right.
That's what it doesn't look like. I mean, because I can see in certain places, when the technical skills are really important, and that's what you're going for because of changes in whatever's happening with the thing. But if you don't have a person that is grounded in certain people skills,
People skills.
they'll
No, and that's one of the things that we sometimes just lose track of, is that not everybody is meant to be a manager or has the perseverance or persistence or diligence or willingness to listen or any of those things that go along with that. There was a hand here, and then we'll move on to story number 2.
Also, it also sounds as if when the employee went to a board member.
That's our second story. So hang on to that one for just a second.
Okay, well, in this case, I would also say that it appeared that the board didn't stay in touch with what was going on operationally, didn't stay in touch with
Yes.
how their employees were reacting, other
See-
employees, and they were therefore potentially in danger of losing.
Yes, that's a very important point that I would hope that these stories or this story illustrates, is how do you know how your executive director or your general manager is doing with the staff? What measures, what information, what process are you using to be able to identify how that's going? I'm not suggesting that this is an everyday kind of thing or that you pop in and chit-chat with all the staff members, because that can make your ED or GM extremely uncomfortable. But I do think that there has to be some mechanism for knowing how is that going. What kind of process? Do you want to use a focus group a couple of times a year and gather a few and talk about the roles and how they feel things are going? Do you want to use a 360 evaluation so the employees have an opportunity to provide evaluation input relative to the general manager or the ED? There are a variety of tools that that can be employed, but not knowing how they're doing with the employees leaves you in an uncomfortable absence of information situation. So what about story number 2? Story number 2 is, if you will recall, we've hired a new general manager. The board has been very clear about what needs to be done, and there's an aggressive agenda because the previous executive or general manager left just at the beginning of really implementing a new strategic plan. The commission or the board feels it's lost a lot of time because they had to go out for a search process. So what do we do? Yes, in the middle back there, and then I'll come up here.
It was the board's job to talk to the GM, not the board's job to tell the employee to talk to the GM.
Okay? So the board has to remember who it supervises. And typically the board supervises one person. And that person directly or indirectly supervises everybody else. Okay, yes?
The board basically made a hiring decision in the middle of a firefighting mode and hired to meet fighting the fire rather than stepping back and looking at the needs, and really didn't take into account some of the internal values of the organization, so that there would, in some organizations, like an arts organization, there's more collaboration and
Certainly.
and things like that, whereas another organization is much more of a taskmaster mess.
Right. So her comment is the board made a hiring decision in the middle of firefighting and really offered direction relative to, quote, all the fires that needed to be fought, without thinking perhaps about the long-term consequences or the relationships that might go along with that. And clearly our ED didn't say, by the way, let's all get together and figure out how to do the board's work and the work on behalf of our constituents, and let's do this together. He took a much more directing, dictatorial, arbitrary kind of approach to all of that. And as a result, the organization struggled. Yes, sir?
There's no operations plan, annual operations plan to set priorities on the various activities. And that should be the responsibility of the board too, where they should be concentrating their efforts initially.
Yes, if we've got a big program of work and we've got a brand new person who has to lead that, the board has to be more supportive and a bit more involved in setting priorities, because if they say simply, we've got all this work to do, and they don't prioritize it, then that level of guidance to the general manager and then his ability to be able to help prioritize for the staff becomes really impossible. So that's an excellent point. Yes?
This kind of speaks a little to the first point brought up, but I think it's really important that as board members, we understand that any kind of an ex parte type contact and involvement with the operations is really a dangerous thing. If that board member had been approached, then I think it should have been incumbent on that member to bring that matter to the full board rather than acting in an ex parte fashion.
Right. And that's really the illustration. It doesn't matter as a commission member. Yes, sir? I was going to say, he said that anytime there is an ex parte communication between a staff member and a single member of the board, that is a very dangerous situation, and that it needs to be brought then to the entire board, or the board member needs to say, have you had a conversation with the GM about this, and what's been the result of that discussion? Because even if you as a board member have a particular coaching or management expertise and you decide that you're going to help the situation and no one will know, I don't know how often the no one will know ever remains no one will know. You know, that I have a belief, and I'm almost ready to call it Clark's axiom, and that is when you tell somebody a secret, what they know you've told them is something they can tell only one other person. And the person who hears that secret knows that they can tell one other person. And by the time you get through, everybody knows. So there is, and nobody needs to know, there is no validity in that concept. So when we step out of our role as part of a larger whole and act unilaterally, when we make a request unilaterally, well, as a board member, I want to see this kind of information. While it's very hard for staff to say, I'm sorry, but I can't do that, or I shouldn't do that, that really is the right response. If you want to see some information, you have to take it to the rest of the board and get the rest of the board to agree to that, say, yes, that's important, and then the board speaks as the voice and the guidance to the executive director, who then speaks to the staff. But if we don't operate that way, and if we think just this one time we can help, it probably has the opportunity to run south really, really fast. And it sets up the wrong dynamic, because it then allows the employee to say, I went to one of the board members, they're going to work on this. It's going to be better, I promise. And what does that teach the rest of the staff? To go around the GM or the executive director. You just cut the legs off of the person that you have hired to fulfill that role. And it means the board is now involved in all kinds of things it's not supposed to be. Your GM is feeling undermined and betrayed, which is really good for board relationships. And you have taught the staff that the board is their advocate and that you are on their side and not working through the GM. So it's absolutely appropriate for the board to remember that it has to work as a single entity, and it has to address these things, and it has to put parameters around that. And some boards do a better job of that than others, and sometimes each of us needs to be reminded, especially when a problem sneaks into our area of specific expertise, because we think this is one of those places I can make a difference. And you can, but it's usually not the difference you intended. So that can be an issue. All right, so what about story number 3? What went wrong? We have a long-term ED We have board members who, because of the election process, are changing from time to time. You have someone who is perceived as, initially, as very competent, an excellent resource, a historian for the organization, and the behavior over time begins to change. It begins to reduce in terms of information and accessibility and willingness to talk about things or provide information in a timely fashion. And the responses, instead of being, certainly we can get you some additional detail or we can make it available for you to talk to so-and-so about that, become a, what are you saying, that I'm not competent and that I'm not in charge, and why are you mucking around in my business? Yes, sir.
Well, I don't think everybody was in the bullying class yesterday, but if we remember, someone that's outwardly expressing bullying behavior is one of the other typical aspects of their personality is dishonesty and some other negative things, so I think it was time to cut bait.
And the comment is that if you were in the bullying session yesterday, you may recall that dishonesty is one of the things that typically goes along with that, and trying to squelch any difference of opinion or any challenge. And that means we probably have a serious problem to address. Yes, sir.
In my experience, it is time to start looking at financials, timesheets, documents, records, everything.
I would absolutely agree. This is a hybrid set of circumstances from a couple of three different situations, but one of the common elements were there were financial problems in all of those. And so therefore, if I am authoritarian and limiting and all of that, why then maybe I can prevent you from learning that. And so that becomes a big deal. Yes, sir, in the back.
Yeah, well, and not only do they have a responsibility as a supervisor to know what's going on, but as they have responsibility to their constituents.
Absolutely. And this is one of the more serious kinds of things. When an executive director or a GM begins to limit the information, begins to report it in a different fashion than it has been reported before, then usually there is something wrong. I will also tell you that from an internal audit standpoint, executive directors and general managers who don't take vacations, not a good thing. They are not taking a vacation because they simply love the organization and can't bear to be apart from it. They are trying to make sure that they are there to manage whatever might bubble up. My background prior to starting, when I was inside on HR assignments, why one of them was in a savings and loan back in the days when those were nice words. And one of the things that was required is that we had to take 5 days contiguous. So we had to take a 5-day vacation, and then we had to take at least 5 days, depending upon how much you had earned, throughout the rest of the year, individual. And the idea was our internal audit department said, if you are gone for a day, nobody does your work. But if you're gone for 5 days, it is likely that something will surface or a question will come up, and therefore you have to, you are more likely to be in a position to examine or discover something. So you may want to think about whether or not that's a policy you want to put in place as a way of being able to just become aware of something that otherwise the organization and you as the board members may not be aware of. Okay? What else about story 3? Anything? Yes, sir.
In our department, we have installed an evaluation program once a year for our CPO.
Okay.
Bring up those things.
Okay. And I think that annual evaluation is a great way to summarize that past year. I will caution that I am concerned about waiting until the evaluation to raise an issue because I think it allows it to then become ingrained. I was speaking with somebody not too long ago who said in her evaluation, she got dinged for something. There was a fairly substantial kind of ding, and she was really surprised and said to